The stagecoach groaned to a stop in front of the depot, wheels grinding against the packed dirt. Eliza Harrow stepped down carefully, one gloved hand on the railing, the other gripping the folded letter she'd read so many times its creases had turned soft. The paper still carried the smell of her father's study ink and stale pipe smoke, and the words, though polite, weighed like iron. You will marry Everett Clay by the end of the month. It will set our family right. The wind cut sharp through the street, bringing grit that caught on her lashes and found the edges of her teeth. She adjusted the dove-gray skirt that hung neatly over the dust, smoothed the travel wrinkles from her jacket, and kept her chin lifted. The town was smaller than she expected, 2 rows of buildings with false fronts leaning against the horizon, a blacksmith's hammer ringing somewhere down the street, and a saloon door slapping back in the wind. She told herself not to linger. Everett's agent was supposed to meet her at the hotel, a man with instructions, a man with the next stage ticket in hand. But the driver was wrestling with the coach's luggage door, muttering at a stubborn latch, and Eliza found her eyes drifting past him toward the corral across the street. That's when she saw him. He leaned against the weathered rail like the day had given him no reason to hurry. Broad shoulders filled the worn canvas of his coat, dust clung to the sweat-dark brim of his hat, and his arms were crossed in a way that made the world look small around him. The bay horse at his side shifted once, blowing through its nose, but he didn't move except to tip his head slightly, studying her as though he'd been expecting her. Her pulse stumbled before she could scold herself. She had met plenty of men in her 22 years, clerks, farmhands, the occasional officer passing through Kansas City. But none of them looked at her like this man did. Not bold, not coy, just steady, measuring maybe. She dropped her gaze, pretending to check the clasp on her traveling bag. The letter in her other hand felt heavier. It wasn't his business who she was, where she was going, but still she felt the shape of his attention as the driver finally wrestled her trunk free and set it on the boardwalk with a thud. Miss Harrow? The hotel porter was suddenly at her elbow, hat in hand, ready to carry her things. She nodded, allowing herself one last glance toward the corral. The man hadn't moved. A curl of wind lifted a streak of hair across his forehead, and for a moment she wondered if he'd nod, or tip his hat, or give her some acknowledgement that the moment between them wasn't hers alone. He didn't. His eyes stayed on her until the porter began loading her things into the waiting wagon. She stepped up into the seat, skirts gathered neatly, and the driver snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward. The town began to slide past in a blur of wood and dust. She told herself not to turn back. She turned anyway. He was still there, leaning on the rail, the bay shifting restlessly at his side. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just watched her go. And Eliza Harrow, bound for a life she hadn't chosen, found herself wondering why a stranger in a cowboy's coat had just unsettled her more than the promise of a banker's ring ever had. The letter lay on the small hotel desk like it had the power to burn through wood. Eliza didn't have to read it again. Every word was already carved into her mind. Her father's debts, her father's shame, and Everett Clay's offer dressed up as rescue. The banker would pay off what was owed, restore the Harrow name to respectability, and in return, she would be his wife before the month's end. She told herself it was a fair exchange. She told herself she could endure anything for a roof and a future, even if it came without love. But in the quiet between the creak of the floorboards and the groan of the wind outside, she knew she was lying to herself. Miles away, Cade Ransom ran his palm over the flank of a restless mare, the animal's hide warm even in the late autumn chill. His ranch spread out in all directions, a patchwork of pasture and sage that most men would envy. But since his brother's death 2 years back, it had felt more like a burden than a legacy. Cade did the work because it needed doing, feeding, mending, moving cattle to lower ground before the snow, but his world had narrowed to the ranch fence and the dirt road that led to town only when supplies demanded it. That morning, one of his neighbors, old Jacob Turner, had stopped by with a bundle of hay twine and the latest town talk. Banker Clay's set to marry some girl come up from Kansas, Jacob said, squinting toward the horizon like the news might be written there. Fine thing, too. Dresses like a preacher's daughter. Pretty as spring water. Cade grunted without much interest, but the words stuck in a place he couldn't shake. Banker Clay wasn't the kind of man who deserved anything fine. By the week's end, Cade had been asked to escort a shipment of cattle through town an errand he would have gladly avoided if not for the fact that his foreman was laid up with a busted ankle. So, just after midday, he rode in at the head of a slow-moving line of beef on the hoof, dust rolling up behind them, the air sharp with the smell of leather and sweat. It was near the mercantile that he saw her again. She stood on the boardwalk in that same dove-gray dress, though now she wore a small felt hat pinned neatly in place. Her hands were clasped before her, posture straight, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that caught his attention. Then he saw why. Everett Clay stood at her side, one hand curled around her elbow, the other gesturing sharply toward something she could not see. She nodded once, and Cade thought it was the sort of nod a person gave when agreeing was safer than speaking. Cade slowed his horse, letting the herd edge past him. From where he sat, he could see Everett's fingers tighten, pulling her closer, his mouth bent to her ear. Whatever he was saying wasn't meant for anyone else. Her eyes lifted, catching Cade's across the space between them. For a moment, the noise of the cattle, the rattle of wagon wheels, even Everett's low murmur faded to nothing. She didn't smile. She didn't look away, but something passed between them, something that didn't belong to a banker's bargain or a father's debt. Everett turned, catching the direction of her gaze. Cade tipped his hat in the barest acknowledgement, then touched his heel to the bay's flank, moving on. He told himself it was none of his business. But as the herd filed down the street and the boardwalk slipped out of sight, he knew the image of her cornered but unbroken was going to follow him long after the dust of town had settled. The day had been loud even before the trouble started. Freight wagons rattled over the packed dirt, stagecoach wheels shrieked against their brakes, and someone was hammering new boards onto the mercantile's front steps. Cade had just finished talking over a shipment of grain with the storekeeper when the sound changed an urgent, uneven thunder of hooves and the sharp metallic jangle of harness gear thrashing out of rhythm. A shout went up from somewhere down the street. Cade turned his head just in time to see the freight team break into Viewa pair of big sorrels, eyes wild, the driver sawing at the reins from the wagon seat. Behind them, the load shifted dangerously, crates groaning and ropes straining. The crowd scattered toward doorways, skirts and coats flaring in the gust kicked up by the horse's charge. Eliza Harrow was still on the boardwalk in front of the milliner's shop. She had been looking in a window, her gloved hand resting against the glass, when the shouts began. Now she turned, frozen for half a second, as the team bore down. Cade didn't think about it. He was moving before his mind caught up, boots hitting the street hard, dust rising with each stride. He caught her by the arm just as the wagon's shadow swallowed the boardwalk, yanking her forward into him, away from the splintering edge. The sorrels thundered past, the wagon rocking dangerously as a crate burst open, scattering packing straw into the air. The driver's curses trailed behind them until they disappeared around the bend. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her shoulder was pressed to his chest, his arm firm around her waist, and he could feel the rapid beat of her breath. Then she straightened, stepping back just enough to look up at him. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady in a way that didn't match the wildness of what had just happened. "Wasn't about to watch you get trampled," he answered, the words coming low and even. They stood there, the space between them charged with something neither was ready to name. Cade noticed the exact shade of her eyes in the afternoon light clear, but shadowed at the edges, like water before a storm. She noticed the way he didn't immediately let go, and when he finally did, his hand lingered a beat too long at her elbow. It was Everett Clay's voice that broke it, sharp, clipped, cutting through the air. "Eliza." She turned toward the sound, and Cade followed her gaze to see the banker striding down the boardwalk, his coat swinging behind him. His eyes landed on Cade first, then on Eliza, and his expression tightened. "What the hell happened?" Everett demanded, stepping between them as though to block her from view. "Runaway team," Cade said, tipping his hat back a fraction. She was in their path. Everett's jaw worked. He didn't thank him. Just took Eliza by the arm too firmly. Cade thought and started to guide her away. She glanced back over her shoulder once, her eyes finding Cade's again. Cade touched the brim of his hat in a brief nod and turned toward his horse. He swung into the saddle without looking back, but the image of her breathless, composed, and not quite willing to break that last look rode with him all the way home. The bell over the mercantile door gave a soft jingle as Cade stepped inside, the dry bite of the wind following him before the door swung shut. The place smelled of burlap and lamp oil, with a faint sweetness from the row of molasses jars near the back. He was there for salt blocks and nails, nothing more, but the low murmur of a familiar voice stopped him before he reached the counter. Eliza Harrow stood near the far shelves, her gloved hands resting lightly on the wood as she leaned toward Mr. Keene, the storekeeper. Her tone was polite, careful, but something in it had a thread of urgency. "I wondered," she said, "if you might have a current stage schedule to Laramie, one that shows which days they run through from here." Keene scratched the back of his neck. "I do, miss, but it's not a common trip from here this time of year. Weather turns, and they don't keep to timetables like they used to." "That's all right," she said quickly. I'd like to know the next one that leaves." She didn't see Cade step into the next aisle, where he could hear without being seen. Her voice lowered, softer now. "If I were to purchase a ticket, could it be held without my name in the register until I arrive?" Keene hesitated. "That's unusual, miss. Folk generally." "I understand," she interrupted, her words clipped, but not unkind. "I'll take the schedule anyway." Cade rounded the end of the aisle then, boots quiet on the worn boards. "Laramie's a long haul this time of year," he said. She turned sharply, the folded paper schedule in her hand. For a moment, she looked ready to deny she'd said anything, but then her shoulders eased just slightly. "I suppose it is." He kept his tone even. "You planning to make that trip alone?" "That's my concern, Mr. Ransom." He stepped closer, not crowding her, but making sure she could see he meant it plain. "If you're set on going, I can see you travel safe. Laramie roads aren't friendly, and not just for the weather." She shook her head. "I'm not set on going anywhere. I was only asking out of curiosity." He gave her a look that said he didn't buy it. Curiosity doesn't usually ask a man to keep a name out of the ledger. Her jaw tightened. She glanced toward the window, where the street outside was pale with dust. "It doesn't matter. I can't go. Not without making things worse." "For who?" "My father," she said, almost under her breath. "And myself. The arrangement with Everett, it isn't just a courtship. It's a settlement. If I leave before the wedding, my father pays for it, in ways he can't." Cade studied her for a long moment. "Everett's kind don't loosen their grip once they've got it. If you're thinking you can wait him out, you can't. Men like that, they'll just pull the rope tighter." Her gaze met his then, something flickering behind her calm. "I appreciate the warning, but I've learned to live with knots I can't untie." He nodded once, though the answer didn't sit right with him. She moved past him toward the door, the paper schedule folded neatly in her hand, and when the bell rang again in her wake, Cade found himself standing there longer than he meant to, wondering how much rope she had left before it was too late to cut her free. The days between the first frost and the heavy snow brought a kind of stillness to town. But for Eliza Harrow, the quiet only made Everett Clay's voice louder. He had taken to arriving unannounced at the hotel, his boots sounding sharp on the hallway floor before he not waited, knocked and stepped inside the sitting room as though it were his by right. He corrected the tilt of her hat before they went out, reminded her to keep her gloves on, told her what colors suited a woman of refinement and which gave the wrong impression. When she wrote letters home to Kansas, He asked to read them before they went into the post. Once, she refused, folding the paper into an envelope and sealing it herself. He held her gaze for a long, thin moment, then set it aside without sending it. She hadn't written another since. Even her walks through the town square once a small freedom were now cut short by Everett's insistence on accompanying her. He claimed it was to protect her from gossip, but she could feel the way his presence turned the air tighter around her. Cade Ransom hadn't seen much of her in those weeks, but her face came to mind often enough, sometimes in the stillness of morning chores, sometimes in the unease that followed certain bits of news. The latest came from a ranch hand who rode in from the north fence line, where Cade's pasture met the creek. Everett's men had been sniffing around the banks, asking about land deeds and water rights, leaving the impression they weren't just passing through. Cade didn't like the sound of it. Water was the spine of this land. Whoever owned it controlled more than just the cattle. He'd intended to ride into town to see the clerk about filing a formal objection. What he didn't expect was to cross paths with Eliza first. It happened outside the mercantile, a rush of townsfolk between them, her hand clutching the fold of her skirt as she stepped down from Everett's wagon. Her eyes caught his for the barest moment, quick, but not hurried. She brushed past, the faintest slip of paper pressed into his palm before she moved on without a word. He didn't open it until he was down the street, leaning against the post outside the telegraph office. The note was small, written in a hand tight enough to hide the shake beneath it. Tomorrow, just after sundown, out by the cottonwoods. He read it twice, the wind tugging at the edges, before folding it carefully into his coat. Whatever she meant to say out there, she didn't trust the walls of town to hear it. That night, Cade sat by the fire with his boots off, staring at the flames but thinking of the grove south of town, where the creek bent and the cottonwoods stood black against the sky. He knew the spot well, quiet, sheltered, far from any eyes that might carry tales. He told himself it was her business, not his, that he had no stake in the way Everett kept his future wife under a thumb. But when the embers burned low and the ranch settled into its nighttime hush, Cade decided he'd be there. And if she came, he'd hear her out, no matter what it cost either of them. The last light of the day was gone by the time Cade reached the cottonwoods. The creek ran dark and low, its slow voice threading through the bare branches. He tied his horse where the bank dipped and waited, the cold settling in quiet and deep. She came without a lantern, her steps careful over the frosted grass. The gray of her coat blended with the shadows until she was near enough for him to see the pale oval of her face, her breath rising in small, steady clouds. She didn't speak right away, only stood with her hands tucked into her sleeves, looking toward the water. "He's moving the wedding up," she said finally, her voice low. "A week from today." Cade stayed still. "That why you asked to meet?" She nodded. "It isn't just for show. Everett's been making things clear. If I try to back out, he'll call in the debt in full. My father can't pay it. He'll lose everything. And Everett—" She hesitated, her mouth tightening. "He's not the kind of man who forgives being embarrassed." Cade's hands were deep in his coat pockets, but he could feel the urge to close them into fists. "Your father's the one who put you in this, isn't he?" She looked down. "He says it's the only way to fix what he's done. He says I should be grateful Everett's willing." "That gratitude he's after?" Cade asked. Her eyes lifted to his, sharp despite the dim light. "No, he wants ownership. Over me, over my family, over every coin in my father's pocket." The cottonwoods swayed a little in the wind. Cade stepped closer, close enough to see the tension in her jaw, the way her shoulders stayed squared even now. "You know there's only one way out without him owning you," he said. Her brow furrowed slightly. "Which is?" "Leave, tonight, before he has a chance to lock his claim in front of the whole town." Her breath caught, though she kept her voice level. "And go where?" "With me," Cade said simply. "You'd be under my roof before dawn. Everett wouldn't dare come that far onto my land, not without a fight he couldn't win. From there, you could decide what comes next. Stay, Go, find work, whatever you wanted. But you'd be free to choose. She looked past him toward the dark stretch of the trail, her hands tightening in her sleeves. If I leave, my father will still be in Everett's debt. Your father put his own name on that paper, Cade said. You didn't. That debt isn't yours to carry. Silence held for a moment, broken only by the creak. She turned back to him, her eyes searching his face as though weighing something heavier than the words between them. If I go, she said slowly, there's no coming back. Cade nodded once. I know. They stood there until the cold worked its way through their coats. When she finally stepped back, she didn't give an answer. She only said, I should go, and started toward town. But as Cade watched her walk away, he saw the way her head lifted, the way her stride steadied. She might be returning to Everett's shadow for now, but somewhere between the creek and the cottonwoods, she'd already decided which way she'd walk when the time came. And Cade meant to be ready when she did. The night she came, there was no warning, only the sound of hooves on the hard ground outside Cade's cabin and the quick, uneven knock on his door. When he opened it, she was there, breathing hard, a small bag slung over her shoulder, the edges of her coat lined with frost. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady, despite the rush in her eyes. He didn't ask if she was sure. He stepped back, letting her in just long enough to grab the Winchester from beside the hearth and his saddlebags from the peg by the door. Minutes later, they were in the saddle, the cold biting at their faces, the only light a sliver moon hanging low over the hills. Cade set a hard pace, not cruel, but relentless enough to eat the miles before anyone in town could know she was gone. The trail wound narrow between stands of bare cottonwoods, the frozen creek glinting like black glass to their right. Her skirts caught on the saddle horn more than once, the fabric bunching against her knees, but she didn't complain. She kept her back straight, her hands firm on the reins of the roan mare he'd saddled for her. The wind had teeth, cutting through coat and wool, turning their breath into white ghosts that vanished as quickly as they came. Behind them, the land fell into darkness, and with it the weight of the town, the banker, the wedding that would never come. They didn't speak until Cade finally drew the horses off the trail to a sheltered bend in the creek. A stand of spruce blocked most of the wind, and the low bank made a natural wall against the cold. He swung down first, tying the horses in the lee of the trees, then set about striking a small fire, coaxing flame from flint until it caught in the dry kindling he'd carried in his saddlebag. She stood near the water, her breath rising in quick bursts, watching the sparks take. Come here, he said, shrugging out of his coat. When she hesitated, he stepped forward, settling it around her shoulders himself. It hung heavy on her, the wool still carrying his warmth. They sat by the fire, the creek murmuring beside them, its voice low under the crust of ice. For a while they listened to the crackle of the flames, letting the heat sink in. What did you leave behind? Cade asked quietly. She stared into the fire. My father's disappointment, the house I grew up in, and the idea that I was meant to make myself small for someone else's comfort. He nodded, the firelight catching in his eyes. I left my brother's grave, and the kind of silence you don't get rid of by talking. They let that sit between them, not as a wound, but as something recognized. When she looked at him again, her voice was softer. I feel safer in the dark beside you than I ever did in daylight beside him. Cade didn't answer right away. He just reached over, his hand finding hers where it rested on her knee. The fire popped, the horses shifted in the shadows, and for the first time in longer than either could measure, the night felt like it was theirs. The horizon was only beginning to pale when Cade's ranch came into view, the first faint lines of the barn roof and the split-rail corral taking shape against the dim blue of the pre-dawn sky. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, their breath fogging and falling away in the cold. The horses moved slower now, their coats damp with sweat, but Cade kept them steady until they crossed the last rise and the land opened up wide and empty in every direction. Eliza had never seen such space. No houses crowding the edge of a road, no lamps burning in a neighbor's window, just the slow roll of hills and the faint trace of the creek winding dark through the pasture. The nearest neighbor, Cade had told her once, was 5 miles off. Out here, a person could vanish from the world if they wanted to. She felt the truth of that now, deep in her chest. They dismounted in the yard, boots crunching over frost-hardened ground. Cade led the horses to the barn, the old boards creaking as he pushed the doors wide. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the scent of hay and horse. He stripped the saddles quickly, running a hand over the bay's flank, then over the roan's neck where Eliza's legs had pressed during the long ride. "Come on," he said when the animals were settled. Inside the cabin, the heat from the banked hearth greeted them, faint but enough to ease the ache in their fingers. Cade set to coaxing the fire back to life while she stood in the middle of the room, his coat still heavy on her shoulders. She didn't know what she'd expected here, someplace rough, a single bed and a table, maybe, but there was more than that. The shelves were lined with neatly stacked tin plates, a coil of rope hung on the wall beside the door, and there was a small rug by the hearth that looked worn from years of someone pacing there on winter nights. He poured water from a kettle into a tin mug and handed it to her. She cupped it in both hands, letting the warmth soak in. He stood across from her, the firelight catching in the dark of his eyes. "You could stay here," he said, not as a question. "Everett won't touch this land, and if he tried, he'd regret it." She lowered the mug. "That would still leave my father." "Your father made his choices," Cade cut in, gentle but firm. "This isn't about him, it's about you. And I don't just mean keeping you safe from Everett. I mean, you belong here." She searched his face, her pulse quickening at the weight of what he wasn't dressing in softer words. "I'm saying we marry," he continued. "Now, before sunrise. There's a preacher who'll come out from Willow Creek if I send for him. We can have it done before Everett even knows you're gone." The fire popped, the sound loud in the quiet. She realized she was holding her breath. "You'd do that for me?" "For us," he said, his gaze steady. "Because you fit here, like you were always meant to. Because I don't want to think about you anywhere else." The wind pressed faintly against the cabin walls, but inside it was still. She felt the cold loosening its hold on her, replaced by something steadier, warmer. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "Yes." It wasn't just an answer to the question. It was a release of every knot that had kept her bound, a step into something she'd chosen for herself. Cade didn't move toward her right away. He just let the word hang between them, solid as the land under their feet, until the firelight stretched across both their faces and dawn began to creep in through the east window. The wind had a restless edge that morning, carrying the smell of snow from the high ridge. Cade was mending a loose hinge on the corral gate when he saw the dust trail coming up from the south. 4 riders. Even from a distance, the shape of the man in front, stiff in the saddle, hat pulled low, was enough to sour his mood. Everett Clay. The 3 behind him were strangers, but their coats bulged at the sides in a way that spoke of holstered iron. Cade closed the gate and leaned his weight against it, waiting. The riders slowed as they drew near, the bay under Everett tossing its head against the bit. When they stopped a few yards from the fence, Everett's eyes swept the yard, searching for something, or someone. "You've got something of mine," Everett said without preamble, his voice carrying over the wind. Cade didn't move. "You'll have to be more specific." "My fiancée," Everett snapped. "She's here, and I'm here to take her back." Cade let the words settle for a moment, studying him. "She's not yours to take." Everett's jaw tightened. "You think a ring and a date don't mean anything? You think you can pull a woman out from under me and claim her like you claim a stray calf?" "No," Cade said evenly. "I think a woman isn't cattle. She chooses where she goes. She chose here." One of the hired men shifted in his saddle, glancing toward Everett, as though waiting for the signal to act. Everett kept his eyes locked on Cade. "You don't understand the arrangement. Her father owes me." "I understand fine," Cade cut in. "You bought yourself a debt, and you thought it came with a person attached, but it doesn't work that way here." The bay stamped and tossed its head again, and Everett's hands twitched on the reins. You think you can hide her? You think I won't come onto this land if I have to? Cade's voice stayed calm, but the steel in it was plain. You cross this gate without an invitation, and it'll be the last mistake you make. The hired men shifted again, eyes flicking between the two. The air felt tight, ready to break. Cade didn't move from where he stood, the fence between them and the yard behind him quiet, except for the sound of the wind in the eaves. For a long moment, Everett just stared, his mouth set in a line. Then he jerked his chin at the men behind him. We're leaving. They wheeled their horses around, but Everett leaned back in his saddle before following. This isn't over, Ransom, he said, his voice low but carrying. You've made an enemy you'll wish you hadn't. Cade watched them ride off, the dust trail thinning in the distance. He didn't move until the last rider disappeared beyond the ridge. When he turned toward the cabin, Eliza was standing in the doorway, her hands folded in front of her, eyes steady on his. He didn't tell her what Everett had said. He didn't need to. She'd heard enough in the quiet after to know the promise in Cade's stance if Everett came again, he wouldn't find the gate open. The ground was still damp from the night's frost when the preacher arrived, his small sorrel horse blowing clouds into the cold air. Cade met him at the yard gate, the two men exchanging a brief word before walking together toward the cottonwoods by the creek. Eliza was already there, her coat buttoned against the wind, a sprig of late sage pinned just above her collar. She didn't fidget or glance around for anyone else. There was no one else to come. That was the point. The preacher's voice was rough from the ride, but steady as he began. The bare branches shifted overhead, their last few leaves whispering against each other. Cade's hands were warm around hers, the roughness of his palms grounding her as the words carried over the water. No grand speeches, no promises they didn't understand, just the truth, spoken plainly, with the creek running at their backs, and the land spread wide in every direction. When it was done, Cade kissed her. It was slow, certain, like a man sealing something he meant to keep. She smiled against his mouth, the first unguarded smile she'd felt in longer than she could name. They walked back to the house together, the preacher riding off toward the ridge until he was only a dark shape against the pale sky. Inside, the fire Cade had banked before dawn still held enough heat to take the chill from the room. She stood by the east wall, looking at the frame he'd built there, a square of fresh-cut wood where there had been nothing but boards before. Tomorrow, he said, I'll set in the glass. She ran her fingers along the frame, imagining the morning light pouring through. East, she said quietly, so I can see the sun before anything else. That's why I built it there, he answered, his voice low behind her. That night, they ate by the fire, the quiet between them not empty but full of the ride that had brought her here, of the stand he'd taken at the gate, of the choice she'd made without anyone else's hand on it. Afterward, he covered her hands with his where they rested on the table. Neither of them said much. They didn't have to. When dawn came, she woke to the soft glow of the first light spilling through the new window, painting the boards gold. She sat up, the quilt falling to her waist, and turned toward it. The land beyond was still, touched with frost, the sky lifting itself out of the dark one shade at a time. She could see the cottonwoods where they'd stood the day before, their shapes etched clean against the horizon. Cade stirred beside her, one arm slipping across her back, pulling her gently against him. She leaned into the warmth of him, her eyes still on the view. The glass wasn't in yet, but the frame was enough for now, enough to see the distance, enough to remind her that she had chosen this place, and him. The sun broke over the ridge, sending a wash of light across the floorboards. She let it touch her face, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and the faint trace of sage. They never left, they never needed to.